Happy Future Friday. Clara, I am so excited to have you here. You have been an incredible force in terms of the future of architecture and sustainable architecture. You're also a member and leading membership at dOrg, which is in the Web3 space, and just have this incredible point of view on what the future could look like around communal living, especially as we age. Before we kick off, I would just love if you could share a little bit about where are you calling in from and what are you working on these days?
I'm calling from a small village nearby Barcelona. And these days I'm focused in mainly three things. First, one of them is creating social housing cooperatives in collaboration with city councils, mostly in the area where I'm based. We are kind of like creating affordable and stable housing in collaboration with city councils so that we can route young population to these small rural centers and incorporate green facilities as well to when we are refurnishing these abandoned places or creating new from scratch. I'm also doing some architecture stuff, but I'm more focused on the user experience that has to do with architecture. And then my third leg that I have my focus on is on dOrg, which is this awesome Web3 developer collective. I'm into this role of members experience, which again has a lot to do with processes and coordination and making sure we keep delivering great services to our clients. We provide job opportunities to our members, and we kind of keep developing and creating awesome tech for the good and for advancing these decentralization.
You have spent a lot of your professional life in architecture. Tell us the story a little bit about this journey into architecture, maybe your personal story, this real emphasis and focus you've then developed on cooperative housing, and then how that in some crazy world then connected you to the Web3 space.
I cannot even remember when I started. I think it was always inside me. So I was 4 and already designing homes, playing with Lego, even Barbies. Yeah, it was kind of very inner. So I always was I want to study architecture. And I remember having this feeling of, cool, I achieved the architectural title. What I do with it right now? And then it's kind of a moment, I think, that you have to trust a lot of your curiosity to kind of lead you to the places that you are meant to be, right? I knew about I was really conscious on self-sustainability and kind of this goal of being independent from the system. So if there's any kind of crash, whatever, you still have your own way to get electricity, to have water facilities, to heat yourself, wherever. It's kind of be independent. And so that because I was really lucky to meet okay Brad when I was really young, to me I was okay guys, I already have my title, so you can hire me whenever you want. And these guys now they're in their 70s, around their 70s, but they've been for 34 years building homes that are self-sustainable and really kind of linked with nature and also with the tradition of construction tradition, local materials of the area where we work. So to me, it was the only way to kind of advance into architecture is that path. But that path had a down issue that was we were designing all these homes, but only for really wealthy people. Everyone should have the right to have a place where they feel comfortable, and that's very linked into the housing as a right of human right to having a space that should be really put into practice. When I was really child, I remember my grandparents got they were kind of removed from their place, from their home, and they were still privileged because they had a second residency, but it was a huge emotional way, especially because my grandparent even was born in that apartment in Barcelona. So kind of I realized how unstable could be housing when you don't have the right to be there as long as you want. And we can talk about that and how you can achieve that, not through ownership, but other like ways, alternatives. And also kind of like, yeah, seeing my mom always, oh, my rent is going to get higher, or even me, myself, my friends, the student friends, like, oh my God, like if you live in gentrified areas, you're kind of like always living with this instability of like, oh, it's only 1 year till my contract ends, so I better start looking for some stuff, because the rental market, it's tough these days. And the last thing that really kind of like was a breaking point for me was when my father brought me to India when I was 15, 14, something like that. And I remember like seeing girls in my age just like living on the streets. And to me, that was like huge inequality, especially like by the fact that the only thing that was like differentiating them and I was that I was like really lucky to being born to the family I was born. And I was like, okay, so then I need to do something with this privilege, because if I reincarnate or something, I might not be that lucky. So I might not have like the opportunity to kind of like do some small actions. I'm not talking about like changing the world, but kind of like just improving some stuff, probably like in my local area, and see if that could be, inspiring to other like communities around the world, for example. Yeah, I got into Web3. I took a gap year and then started to travel and kind of like get into all the things that I was curious about, and discovered about blockchain, and went through all the rabbit hole, and just found out yeah, it was like it fitted really well with my values and the vision that I had. So I discovered DAOs, which were kind of like, yeah, cooperatives but digital, cool. You can own assets by the community, awesome. You can agile governance processes. You can have like, create tools for governance, for incentives, for financing even the projects without relying into banks or governments. So it just like all makes sense to me. And so that in 2020, when I came back from that trip with a couple of more friends, we participated on a hackathon in the States, where we had this idea. We came up about this project of creating a platform for a community to kind of like meet up and create housing communities from there that could be like run and owned by the own community, whether it was like social housing or more like intentional communities through DAOs. And the goal, as I've been saying, it's more about like breaking from the mortgage way, from getting like super high rents, from getting instability, from the isolation that we suffer in our society, especially like in the elder years, and kind of like coming up together, pulling money and creating something collectively as well. And yeah, we realized we were too early actually. Co-housing, cooperative housing was already like a big change on people's mindset. So kind of like talking about like Web3 was just like too much to handle in a single shot. So, and then the target of people we had in mind was people like my mom, my dad, my brother, like my friends, myself, right? So it was just like not targeting Web3 community at that time. And so that we decided to kind of like start by creating single communities in our local territories, and then from there like scaling slowly until we got like a process that was like systemized, and maybe like slowly introducing some digital tools or Web3 tools that we can agile these processes. And then in parallel, I was like super keen on discovering more about DAOs and kind of like getting hands-on in one. So I started like researching for positions, and I got accepted at dOrg, and it's been like a great great journey so far with the whole community of developers.
So I'd love to know what you feel like is your hot take or maybe your controversial opinion of what the future could look like for housing. What are some of the things you're seeing that get you really excited?
I think what gets me more excited is like how people are realizing that they could self-organize to create alternatives. And for example, in that field, my vision is to kind of like create a part of like the real estate market where the apartments where housing is kind of like run and owned by their communities. So that means that we make sure that the prices are stable. And also like at a scale, for example, like in Vienna, they have like a huge stock market of cooperative housing. And that means that they are able even to regulate the market prices. And that's like really powerful in terms of like transitioning from ownership model. Like, for example, in Spain, like we were raised into, you have to own a home, right? So what happens when you have a generation of young people that their salaries doesn't allow them to kind of like buy something, or people like they don't want to rely in banks or be attached in banks for 40 years or something, right? So there's another alternative that uses like the right to use of space through the cooperative model, which means like the ownership of the place will be always on this legal entity that we call cooperative. And then their members will be able to use it for as long as they want. And that means like our lives kind of like are really likely to change direction, change place, wherever, like, but still like we would be able to kind of like easily jump to one cooperative housing to the other without all the paperwork of going to notaries and stuff like that. It's just something that it's managed at the organizational level of the community. And that gives a lot of like flexibility, plus makes people like don't rely on mortgages for years. Because if something comes up, or you just, I don't know, you want to take a sabbatical year, you could do that because somebody else will take the place of the community on the cooperative for you, and then they will take care of like the payments. So I think that's kind of like really revolutionary, especially like if you add the layer of the community, and then on top of that layer of self-sufficiency in terms of like energy or even like food sovereignty. So this is kind of like really, really powerful.
Are there any people or companies or cooperatives that are really inspiring you right now that people listening could research or follow along? Because it is such a massive problem. And sometimes the thing that can motivate people most is just seeing solutions that are working and understanding the components so that they can replicate it.
Yeah, I would say in the urban level, for me, one example that's really revolutionary because of like all those layers that I've just taught, it's La Borda. It's spelled Laborda in Barcelona. And it's a building of mostly 40 units and then community spaces. Really cool. Like the building, it's also like beautiful. And it's kind of like low budget, I would say, in terms of like housing. So just really well managed. And in terms of like more rural, I probably would go for CAN space CNSES, Calcasas. It's another like rural example in Barcelona. It was like the first cooperative project in 2011. And that one is more rural, more into communal life that doesn't have to fit for everyone. For example, like for me, like probably like I wouldn't be a good fit for communal life, but it's still, I would like to have like community around keeping kind of like my privacy and my own spaces.
And you made a good point earlier around like housing ownership feels like it's just exclusive to wealthy people. And I'd love to get your take or share maybe your perspective on some of the funding mechanisms that you've seen. like, what does this look like? How much does it end up costing to pool? How are people physically pooling their money, especially when there can be restrictions on private funds, for example? So I'm just curious, like what you're seeing working for the funding mechanisms to then ultimately invest in a pretty visionary, like whether it's a rehabilitation of a place or a reconstruction project.
So I can talk you, for example, of the last numbers we did for a cooperative project that we are starting in a rural area. It's about like 16 homes, in this case, like no common spaces, just like 16 units with their own backyards, between 4 and 3 rooms for each house. And here, like the numbers were like, we need a kind of like high down payment for families. And that down payment, it's refundable when you decide to leave. And so that covers like the 20% of the total finance, like finances of the project, because the other like 80%, it's a mix of subsidizes, like grants from the government, because in this case it's like social housing. So which means that we can get probably 20% of by government. And then, so the rest of like the 60% in this case, it's money that we ask either ethical banks, because here are the only ones that recognize cooperative entities eligible for mortgages, or also kind of like family, friends, acquaintances, or investors that want to kind of like invest in that project, but with a very small return. In that case, we're talking about like 2.5, 3% return of the investment. Whereas like the banks currently, we are calculating at 4 point something return of the investment. And then people like users who are going to live in these places, they have to pay like a monthly fee that covers the mortgage, and then some, maintenance fees to kind of like don't have surprises in the long term and accumulate some resources for the cooperative. And what that means that during probably 30 years, 40 years, during the mortgage phase, monthly fees are going to be kind of like high. And here we are talking about like 1,700 euros per month, which for families who are on the social housing, let's say income capped, it's quite high, but it's still like possible. But after like the phase of returning the mortgage, this monthly fee drops like dramatically till probably like 300 to 50. And that's what they are going to be paying for the rest of like the phases of connivance of these projects. So our projects, that they need to have like this long-term vision of, we know that at the beginning we'll need some more like finance efforts, but then it's something that really allows for, super affordable rents or monthly payments, that when you decide to leave, you'll get back that initial high investment that you made.
And so the supply and demand must be so interesting, right? Because you have 16 houses, so many rooms. How do you have selection criteria of who ultimately gets those houses? And, is there an income requirement? I imagine if you're taking public funding, I'm curious like how that is playing with maybe even trends of not even just low income, but, anyone looking to form and coordinate capital to then have, this dream compound. I think I hear it all the time from friends. Like, I just want to start a community and co-live and co-parent, and, how do I do that? So I'm curious, it feels like there's just sort of these opportunities at like the lower end and then maybe like the ultra high end, but nothing I've really seen in the middle. So I know it's a lot of questions at once, but I'm curious, how you're seeing this whole dynamic play.
Those like really good questions. Like in social housing, since we have like the government like leg in between. They regulate a part of it, which is like people have to be living in the area for at least 2 years, have a certain amount of income caps. And then this is also like super important. They need to have like no properties on their own. That's like the criteria from the government. But then at the local scale, we also have like add some kind of like counting points for kind of like incentivizing people who are already living in that village. And then specifically like giving, for example, like more points to young families, to disabled people, to mothers that have gone through, I don't know, like some sort of violence, to kind of like give some priorities to certain collectives that might be more in need of, or have more difficulties to access like housing in that front. And this is something like we discussed together with the local city councils. In the, let's say, more like when you don't need to rely on social housing cooperative, you want to start your own. I think it's more about like creating intentional communities. So it usually starts with a group of 2, 3, 4 people. Usually it's up to 6 that they have like a shared vision and they work on that vision. And here, like I always advise to be like very specific. So when you say like, hey, I want a community to be sustainable, just write down what means sustainable to you, because it's not that straightforward for everybody. And I could be meaning some stuff and you another stuff. So we want to be specific here. And then with that vision, we kind of like go out and expand like our communications, our network to kind of like capture more people. And also, this is in parallel of scouting locations as well. And then having probably like more talent and more resources to scout more deeply into locations. And from there, it's kind of like a process where I think that I really advise people to have like professional advisors, whether it's in the facilitation, in the economy, legal, architecture fields, because it's tough. It's tough. Only 10% of the communities succeed. So it's kind of like tough to get there, also takes a lot of time. So if you can adjust some of these processes or just not fall into the recurring mistakes that people do, because it's the first time we are doing that, so we don't know about it, right? So if we can skip that, I think we smooth the process, and we also increase the chances of succeeding in that community.
And what role are you seeing decentralization and Web3 or blockchains playing in this space? Because so far we've talked about more kind of physical, systemic design. And obviously with dOrg, you're coordinating a whole developer community who are often like creating open source software that's like forkable, and like that makes so much sense in a technology stance. To your point, like it doesn't feel like there's this like repeatable, forkable framework for cooperative housing and participatory design. Like, how do you see those worlds playing, if at all, right now, or how do you think they could work together?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I think we are not yet, at least for the target of people that we are currently like working on, because they struggle with just Google Drive and stuff like that. So we are kind of still far from introducing them to MetaMask and stuff like that. But I see Web3 kind of like accelerating and replicating a lot, like the organization design behind those cooperatives, because there's no setup. Like, I mean, every community kind of like customizes their setup. And for example, I see Web3 kind of like being super handy in creating incentives for people to do certain actions, or even to kind of like raise with governance power or even like ownership power to certain people who might not reach like the economic requirements, but they are kind of like there. So maybe they can provide more workforce to kind of like be able to enter in those communities. And you can make sure that this process kind of like it's traceable, and then it's like recognized through the power of leveraging like Web3 structures and mechanisms. And then also I see Web3 kind of like really helping into the funding part, because right now, for example, it's one of like the main struggles, because when you already have like the place, the community, the whole setup, you have to look for outside funds, and you need to rely on banks, which usually don't see these kind of projects like in very good eyes. So I see whether it's like public funds or even like kind of like collective kind of like financial bank systems in the crypto space that could work and could help those communities like replicate easily and scale up in many different like locations all over the world. And yeah, kind of like I see that and also like in governance, sorry, like because we have like systems that can calculate super easily the governance, and also allow us to not need to be present in place, because that also takes a lot of time in decision making, assemblies and stuff like that. So kind of like this is more Web3 probably, Web2 probably, but kind of like introducing some digital tools to accelerate all the coordination mechanisms that happen behind the scenes in communities. I think would be also like really good. It could save a lot of time.
Super interesting. Well, Clara, thank you so much for everything you shared. I know we could talk for hours about this. I'm personally so interested and hope to one day live in a cooperative community. So I can't wait to keep in touch. How can we stay in contact with you personally and the projects that you're working and excited about?
Oh, so yeah, you can find me on socials. It's always Clara Gromaches, Gromaches. And yeah, on my website, there's also like the information of the projects that I participated, and also this kind of like a spoiler here, but I'm scouting locations. So in Southern Europe. So if anybody like is curious, like feel free to leave your email so I can keep you posted of the next steps. Because for a while, I started in 2020, like I started a project of Web3 communities and DAOs, but we were like just too early. So, but I'm kind of like thinking it's already like time to kind of like repick this project and kind of create a community from scratch.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely be following along. Keep me posted. Very excited to learn more. And we'll be in touch. Thanks so much, Clara. This has been great.
Thank you for having me. It was super great to be here. Thank you, Elena.